Why are we feeling so pulled apart? That's the actual Latin word for distracted. When something is distracted, it's pulled apart. And I think the bigger question is, how do we limit those distractions at work? Hey, go check out bopwebinar.com for our latest webinar coming up here in just a couple of weeks. And whatever that webinar is that's coming up at the time of this recording will be on that link, bopwebinar.com. Our webinar coming up here in the next couple of weeks is actually how to limit distraction and prepare for 2023. So we've got 4 major areas that we're going to walk you through. It'll be really, really powerful. Bob Roberts is a larger-than-life Baptist preacher turned global engagement pioneer and independent global diplomat whose best friends are now people far outside of his own East Texas tribe. Bob began mentoring me a couple decades ago with his words, his actions, and periodically his time. And I'll never forget the day he drove me to Barnes & Noble in the mid-cities of the Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex and loaded me up with what today are some very foundational books in my own personal library still. Dallas Willard's The Divine Conspiracy and Thomas Friedman's The World is Flat were 2 of the books that he bought for me in that stack, and still 2 of my top 5 all-time reads. And there were a couple of other nuanced books that threw me off at the time. In fact, I would say that probably all of them threw me off. There was a book from Henri Nouwen and another about a now renowned Impressionist artist, Vincent van Gogh. Perplexed, as Bob bought me these books, I dove into those books on global engagement as they spoke to my inner desire for a circumnavigate-able adventure. Nouwen and Van Gogh, those would wait. Now, I read them periodically throughout the last 20 years, but 20 years later, just a couple of weeks ago, I picked up a book entitled Learning from Henri Nouwen and Vincent van Gogh. That then led me to another Nouwen title, The Way of the Heart. We are asked frequently by business owners, why do I feel like I work day and night and yet get nothing done? Henri Nouwen makes reference to a wordy world that we inhabit and then lobs this thought in. He says, we move through life in such a distracted way that we do not even take the time and rest to wonder if any of the things we think, say, or do are worth thinking, saying, or doing. Now, Vincent van Gogh is said to have been a largely unrecognized artist while alive, except among those who knew him and his tight circle of outcasts. Although Van Gogh had long since passed when Nouwen was alive, Henri Nouwen wanted to understand Van Gogh's relentless pursuit of a compassionate life, a life that compelled him to shed ministerial garb for the poverty-stained garments and conditions of Dutch peasants. And that's what he painted about early on in his career. Henri Nouwen built a relationship with Dr. Vincent van Gogh, the artist's nephew, who was key in the realization of the museum that bears his last name now in Amsterdam, a museum that my daughter and I have actually been to. Carol Berry writes in Learning, says this, Henry asked Dr. Van Gogh why so many people flocked daily by the thousands to look at his uncle's paintings. What was it about Vincent, the artist, that touched a chord that resonated deeply with us? Henri Nouwen related Dr. Vincent van Gogh's answer. He said, because people feel comforted and consoled, Vincent was able to crawl under the skin of nature and people and find there something truthful, something beautiful, something joyful, and something worth seeing. He was able to draw out the inner secret of what he saw. So here's the question for us as business owners. How was Bob Roberts able to make the time to take me to a bookstore 2 decades ago and plant powerful seeds of books of thought that would circle back to make influence 20 years later? How was Carol Berry able to share wisdom and insight from 2 major influencers of human compassion from the academic world and the art world and merge those 2 things together? How was Van Gogh able to crawl under the skin of nature and people and find there something truthful? Well, each one of those made a singular decision. Now, they made it on repeat over and over and over again, but it was the same decision. And that decision was this: ignore the other things they could have done and commit to the important things that require their uniqueness and their imagination. Skye Jethani writes in his book, The Divine Commodity, that Van Gogh, quote, warned other artists, do not quench your inspiration and your imagination. Do not become the slave of your model. Now, I have to be really careful in our coaching world about that idea. And it really jumped off the page at me as I read it. Do not become the slave of your model. Put another way, do not become a slave to the monotonous distraction that's in front of you. Jethani goes on to say this: we've been conditioned to avoid silence at all costs, lest we be comforted with our own inner chaos. Check that, lest we be confronted with our own inner chaos. And where there is no exterior noise, we feverishly work to produce it. When we submit ourselves to constant distraction, to the latest, loudest voice, or worse, when we manufacture our own distraction, we are selling our soul, we're selling our creativity, and we're selling our own narrow brilliance for the empty currency of non-caloric entertainment that will need to be refreshed and even more outrageous in about an hour. So how do we limit distractions? I think if you went back and looked at all of those voices speaking, they would say this: begin by practicing solitude. Now, this is not isolation. Isolation is not solitude. Henri Nouwen describes solitude as the furnace of transformation. Without solitude, he says, we remain victims of our society and continue to be entangled in the illusions of the false self. Solitude is not a private therapeutic place. Rather, Nouwen says, it is the place of conversion, the place where the old self dies and the new self is born. We will not find solitude. We must make time for solitude. We must make time. We must make place. We must make opportunity to sit and be confronted with imagination, with thought, with anger, frustration, joy, excitement. Without stopping and pausing and making time to see those things, we cannot experience those things. For some of you, business has become a tired, repetitive cycle moving from frustration to frustration. You've become the slave to your model, and the freshness of your dreams and imagination has died. Distraction is not just robbing productivity. Distraction is robbing your own soul. So, might I suggest you make time to walk? Go walk into a bookstore and find a book on Van Gogh and just stare at the pictures for a while. And may that help rekindle your imagination and inspiration for the mission of your business. Or you can just go back to scrolling your feed.